In the winter of 1841, residents of Philadelphia's Kensington district began reporting sightings of a small girl wandering the cobblestone streets at dawn, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow that formed peculiar patterns across the frozen ground. The child, no more than 8 years old, would stand motionless for hours outside the Pennsylvania hospital, staring at the building's imposing brick facade, with eyes that seemed far too old for her face, occasionally moving her lips as if reciting something from memory. When approached by concerned citizens, she would speak in medical terminology that no child of her age should know, describing surgical procedures with clinical precision and anatomical details that made grown men turn pale with discomfort. City records from that winter, buried deep in the Philadelphia Municipal Archives for over a century and discovered only during a 1943 renovation, reveal that 37 separate witness reports were filed about this mysterious child. Yet no official investigation was ever launched, and the reports themselves were marked with a peculiar notation that translates to medical discretion advised. The truth about Sarah Montgomery and what happened to her inside the walls of Philadelphia's most prestigious medical institution remained hidden behind locked doors and sealed documents until now. Before we continue with the story of Sarah Montgomery and the horrifying medical conspiracy that silenced an entire city, I need you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like Sarah's deserve to be told, and the medical establishment of the 1840s worked very hard to ensure they never would be. And please, let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. You might be surprised how close to home these dark secrets really are. Because what happened in Philadelphia was far from an isolated incident. The story that follows will take us deep into the shadowed halls of 1840s medical science, where the line between healing and harm was dangerously thin, where human experimentation was considered a necessary evil for the advancement of knowledge, and where a young Irish immigrant girl became the unwilling subject of experiments that would have horrified even the most hardened physicians of our modern era. Philadelphia in 1841 stood as America's undisputed medical capital, a city where the nation's brightest minds gathered to push the boundaries of scientific knowledge in ways that would be unthinkable today. The Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in 1751 by Benjamin Franklin himself, attracted physicians from across the Atlantic who came to study under America's most renowned medical professors. The city boasted more medical schools per capita than any other American metropolis, and its physicians published more research papers than their counterparts in Boston, New York, and Baltimore combined. But beneath this veneer of scientific progress lurked darker truths about how medical knowledge was acquired in an era before ethical oversight, patient consent, or government regulation of medical practice. The concept of informed consent would not emerge for another century, and the idea that medical experiments required approval from oversight committees was entirely foreign to physicians of the 1840s. In this environment, ambitious doctors operated with a freedom that would be considered criminal today, particularly when their subjects came from the city's most vulnerable populations. The city's Kensington district, where Sarah Montgomery first appeared that winter, housed successive waves of Irish immigrants fleeing the potato blight that would soon devastate their homeland entirely. These families, desperate and destitute, crowded into ramshackle tenements along the Delaware River, where cholera outbreaks claimed entire families within days. Industrial accidents maimed workers with horrifying regularity, and children often disappeared into the city's notorious orphanages, never to be seen again. The mortality rate in Kensington exceeded 30% in some years, and city records from the period show that immigrant children had a life expectancy nearly 15 years shorter than their counterparts in Philadelphia's wealthier districts. It was here, among the forgotten poor who had no political voice and few legal protections, that certain members of Philadelphia's medical establishment found their most vulnerable and convenient subjects for experimental procedures that would never have been attempted on patients who could afford legal representation or had connections to the city's political elite. Dr. Cornelius Thorne had built his reputation on revolutionary treatments for what physicians of the era euphemistically called hysteria, nervous disorders, and melancholia, conditions that encompassed everything from what we now recognize as depression and anxiety to more severe psychological trauma. His private practice on Walnut Street, housed in a magnificent 4-story townhouse that had once belonged to a signer of the Declaration of Independence, catered exclusively to Philadelphia's wealthiest families who paid astronomical sums for his pioneering therapies involving mercury compounds imported from European mines, opium derivatives processed in his own private laboratory, and electric stimulation devices that he had personally designed after studying similar equipment in London and Paris. Thorne's published papers in the American Journal of Medical Sciences had earned him international recognition, with physicians from as far away as Vienna and Edinburgh traveling to Philadelphia to observe his methods. His correspondence with European colleagues, preserved in the archives of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, reveals a man obsessed with pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge regardless of the human cost. In a letter to Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Heidelberg, Thorne wrote, "The advancement of medical science requires a willingness to explore territories that conventional morality might consider forbidden. Our oath is to healing, but healing on a grand scale sometimes demands sacrifices that individuals cannot understand." Yet few questioned the source of his extensive case studies on childhood psychological disorders, research that required access to dozens of young subjects over extended periods. Access that would have been impossible through legitimate medical channels, given the limited number of wealthy families willing to subject their children to experimental treatments. Sarah Montgomery's parents, Bridget and Seamus, had arrived in Philadelphia aboard the merchant vessel Celtic Dawn in September 1840, carrying nothing but their 8-year-old daughter, a few personal belongings wrapped in oiled cloth, and dreams of escape from Ireland's grinding poverty that had already claimed Bridget's parents and 2 siblings to starvation and disease. Seamus found backbreaking work in the textile mills that lined the Schuylkill River, earning wages that barely covered rent on a single room, while Bridget took in washing from wealthy households in Society Hill, scrubbing clothes by hand in water so cold it left her fingers cracked and bleeding throughout the winter months. They rented their meager accommodations in a Kensington boarding house owned by Mrs. Agnes Kellerman, a German immigrant who had fled Prussia in 1838, under circumstances she never fully explained, but which seemed to involve her late husband's political activities and their subsequent persecution by Prussian authorities. Mrs. Kellerman kept meticulous records of her tenants, their occupations, their health, their family relationships, and their financial circumstances, creating detailed documentation that would later prove crucial to understanding Sarah's fate and the systematic nature of what happened to immigrant children in Philadelphia during this period. The winter of 1840–41 proved particularly brutal for Philadelphia's immigrant population, with temperatures dropping to levels not seen in decades and snow accumulating to depths that made travel through the city's unpaved streets nearly impossible for weeks at a time. Seamus Montgomery developed a persistent cough from cotton fibers that gradually worsened into what we now know was pneumoconiosis or brown lung disease, a condition that would eventually destroy his respiratory system entirely. As his condition deteriorated and medical bills mounted, physicians charged immigrants double their normal rates, knowing they had no alternative sources of care. The Montgomery family faced a choice that thousands of desperate immigrant families confronted each winter: surrender their child to one of the city's charitable institutions that promised food, shelter, education, and medical care in exchange for the parents' legal guardianship rights. These institutions, ostensibly operated by religious organizations and medical societies, actually served as pipelines that funneled vulnerable children toward the experimental research that funded Philadelphia's medical advancement, but required subjects who could not protest, escape, or seek legal recourse when procedures went wrong. On the morning of January 15th, 1841, Agnes Kellerman made her usual rounds through the boarding house, collecting rent and checking on the welfare of her tenants, when she discovered Sarah Montgomery's room completely empty. The child's few possessions, a worn doll made from scraps of Irish wool, a small wooden cross that had belonged to her grandmother, and the tattered dress she had worn on the ship from Ireland, had all vanished along with the girl herself. Left behind on the rough wooden table was a single piece of paper, written in elegant script that clearly belonged to an educated hand rather than the crude writing of working-class immigrants. The note, preserved in Mrs. Kellerman's personal papers and later donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, stated, "The child, Sarah Montgomery, has been placed in proper medical care for her own welfare and advancement. The family's outstanding debts for medical services rendered to Seamus Montgomery are hereby considered satisfied in full. Further inquiries regarding this placement are neither necessary nor advisable." The note bore an official-looking seal that purported to represent the Philadelphia Medical Society, though subsequent investigation revealed that no such organization existed in any public records, corporate filings, or professional directories of the period. Bridget Montgomery's screams that morning echoed through the boarding house corridors and drew neighbors from 3 blocks away, creating a commotion that lasted for hours and required intervention by city constables. She claimed that men in dark coats had visited during the night, speaking in whispers with her husband while she pretended to sleep, and that she had heard Seamus sobbing quietly after they left. When pressed for details, she admitted that she and Seamus had signed papers they couldn't read. Desperate to secure continued medical treatment for Seamus's worsening condition, and believing their daughter would receive proper schooling and return to them once their financial situation improved. When the Montgomery parents attempted to locate Sarah through official channels, visiting every hospital, orphanage, and religious institution in Philadelphia, they were told consistently that no such child had been registered at any authorized facility. City clerks, hospital administrators, and church officials all claimed to have no record of Sarah Montgomery, despite the official-looking documentation the family had received. Even more disturbing, when Bridget Montgomery attempted to file a missing person report with city authorities, she was informed that children placed in medical care by parental consent could not be considered missing, and that further investigation would require legal representation the family could not afford. The truth behind Sarah's disappearance was far more sinister than a simple case of medical debt or child placement. Dr. Cornelius Thorne and a select group of Philadelphia's most ambitious physicians had established what they privately called the Society for the Advancement of Neurological Science, a completely clandestine organization that acquired children from desperate immigrant families under the elaborate guise of charitable medical care and educational advancement. These children became unwilling subjects in experimental treatments designed to test the limits of human psychological manipulation, pharmaceutical intervention, and what Thorne termed cognitive restructuring, procedures that attempted to fundamentally alter children's mental development through carefully controlled trauma and chemical intervention. The society operated through a network of intermediaries who identified vulnerable families, legal representatives who created documentation that appeared official but had no legal standing, and medical facilities hidden within Philadelphia's industrial district that bore no resemblance to legitimate hospitals or research institutions. The entire operation was funded through a combination of Thorne's private practice profits, contributions from wealthy families who benefited from his refined treatments, and payments from European medical schools that purchased detailed case studies of his experimental results. Sarah Montgomery was transported that January night to a private facility cunningly hidden within the basement levels of an abandoned warehouse near the Philadelphia port, a building that had once stored imported textiles but now served a much darker purpose. The building, officially owned by the Delaware Medical Supply Company, a shell corporation that existed only on paper, served as the Society's primary research facility, equipped with primitive surgical suites, pharmaceutical preparation areas, and holding cells disguised as children's bedrooms. Here, children were subjected to carefully documented experiments involving graduated doses of mercury, laudanum, and other substances, their reactions meticulously recorded in leather-bound journals that detailed every aspect of their psychological and physical responses over periods that sometimes lasted for years. The experiments followed scientific protocols that Thorn had developed through correspondence with European colleagues who conducted similar research on prison populations and political dissidents, adapting their methods for use on children whose developing minds were considered more malleable and responsive to intervention. The initial examination notes for Subject S41, the designation assigned to Sarah Montgomery in Thorn's clinical records, described a healthy 8-year-old girl who demonstrated normal cognitive function, appropriate emotional responses for her age, and no signs of the psychological disorders that Thorn intended to either induce or cure through his experimental treatments. Dr. Thorn's personal notes, discovered decades later hidden behind a false wall in his Walnut Street office, revealed his particular interest in Sarah's exceptional memory capacity and her demonstrated ability to learn complex information with unusual rapidity, characteristics that made her an ideal candidate for what he termed accelerated cognitive restructuring experiments. The basement facility where Sarah and other children were held represented the culmination of Thorn's ambitions to create what he called a controlled environment for neurological research. The space had been meticulously designed to eliminate outside influences that might interfere with experimental results. With walls lined with sound-dampening materials, artificial lighting that could be manipulated to disrupt natural sleep cycles, and a ventilation system that allowed for the controlled introduction of various chemical vapors during psychological conditioning sessions. The weeks following Sarah's disappearance brought increasingly strange and disturbing reports from across Philadelphia's medical district. Stories that were initially dismissed as imagination or hysteria, but gradually formed a pattern that suggested something deeply wrong was occurring within the city's medical establishment. Hospital orderlies working night shifts at Pennsylvania Hospital began whispering about hearing children's voices echoing from basement levels that were supposed to contain only storage areas and utility equipment, voices that seemed to be reciting medical terminology and anatomical descriptions with a precision that seemed impossible for young children. Nurses reported finding surgical instruments arranged in patterns that resembled children's games. Scalpels laid out like dolls, forceps arranged to form letters of the alphabet, and bandages tied into elaborate knots that showed a sophistication of technique that suggested extensive training. Most disturbing were the accounts from medical students who claimed to see a small girl observing their anatomy lectures from the back of amphitheaters, taking notes in a manner far too sophisticated for a child, and occasionally correcting professors when they made errors in their presentations. These sightings always occurred in peripheral vision, and when students turned to look directly, the figure would be gone, leaving only the faint scent of mercury and laudanum that had become associated with Thorn's experimental treatments. The medical school faculty dismissed these reports as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by the demanding nature of medical education. But the consistency of the descriptions, always a small girl with prematurely aged eyes, always taking notes, always seeming to understand complex medical concepts, suggested something more troubling than student imagination. Dr. Thorn's research progressed with methodical precision during the winter months of 1841. His experimental logs documenting a systematic approach to psychological manipulation that combined elements of what we now recognize as classical conditioning, pharmaceutical dependency, and behavioral modification. His logs, written in a complex code that mixed Latin medical terminology with numerical sequences representing dosages and time intervals, documented Sarah's responses to various pharmaceutical combinations with the detached precision of a scientist studying laboratory animals rather than a physician treating a human patient. The experiments followed a carefully planned progression that Thorn had developed through years of preliminary research on adult subjects. first establishing baseline behavioral patterns through extensive observation and testing, then introducing graduated doses of mercury compounds to observe neurological effects and measure changes in cognitive function, followed by opium derivatives to test pain tolerance and psychological malleability, and finally combinations of substances designed to create what Thorne termed controllable dissociative states, in which subjects could be programmed to respond to specific stimuli in predetermined ways. The most chilling entries in Thorne's logs described Sarah's gradual transformation under the influence of his treatments, a process that he documented with the same clinical detachment that he applied to all his research subjects. Initially, she displayed entirely normal childhood responses: fear, confusion, crying for her parents, and attempts to escape or resist the procedures being performed on her. However, as the experiments continued and the chemical alterations to her developing brain accumulated, she began demonstrating an unsettling adaptation to her circumstances that exceeded Thorne's most optimistic projections. Within 6 weeks of her arrival at the facility, Sarah had learned to recite complex anatomical terms with perfect pronunciation, could identify surgical instruments by touch alone, even when blindfolded, and displayed an understanding of medical procedures that shocked even Thorne's most experienced colleagues. More disturbing still, she began to demonstrate what Thorne described as empathic dissociation, the ability to observe and analyze her own suffering with clinical detachment, while simultaneously maintaining emotional awareness of the pain being inflicted upon her. Mrs. Agnes Kellerman, driven by a combination of maternal concern and suspicions rooted in her own experiences with authoritarian medical practices in Prussia, made repeated and increasingly desperate attempts to gather information about Sarah's whereabouts and condition. Her methodical approach to investigation, inherited from her late husband's work as a political organizer, led her to document every conversation with authorities, every failed attempt to trace Sarah through legitimate channels, and every inconsistency in the official explanations provided by medical and governmental institutions. Her investigation revealed disturbing patterns that extended far beyond Sarah's individual case. She discovered that immigrant families throughout Kensington had reported similar disappearances over the previous 3 years, always following the same pattern. Initial contact by well-dressed men who spoke eloquently about medical care and educational opportunities. Official-looking documentation that parents couldn't read but felt compelled to sign. And subsequent complete inability to trace the children through any legitimate institution or authority. Mrs. Kellerman's background: she had witnessed medical experiments conducted on political prisoners in Prussian jails during the 1830s, made her acutely sensitive to the signs of systematic medical abuse disguised as legitimate research or charitable care. Her detailed records, maintained in a mixture of German and English that made them difficult for casual observers to understand, would eventually provide crucial evidence for investigators who would finally expose the truth about Philadelphia's hidden medical experiments. Meanwhile, other immigrant families in Kensington began reporting similar disappearances with alarming frequency. The Flanagan boy, age 7, vanished after his parents signed papers for his educational placement at what they were told was a prestigious boarding school. The Kowalski twins, ages 9 and 10, were taken for medical assessment and never returned, despite promises that the evaluation would last only a few days. The Riley girl, age 6, disappeared after her mother was convinced that specialized medical treatment would cure the child's persistent nightmares. Each family had been approached by the same well-dressed men who spoke with authority about opportunities for their children, medical care that would address health problems the families couldn't afford to treat, and educational advancement that would lift their children out of poverty permanently. Each family had been desperate enough to believe promises that seemed too good to be true, and each family had discovered too late that the documentation they had signed contained legal language that permanently surrendered their parental rights under circumstances that made legal challenges impossible. The warehouse facility where these children were held had been transformed into a grotesque parody of a legitimate medical institution, complete with research libraries, surgical suites, and educational facilities that served the dual purpose of advancing Thorne's experimental agenda while creating the illusion that the children were receiving beneficial treatment. The children were taught to assist with each other's examinations, to record symptoms and reactions with clinical precision, and to maintain emotional detachment even as they witnessed procedures that would have traumatized adult observers. They were rewarded for compliance with better food, warmer clothing, books and educational materials, and the constant promise that their cooperation would eventually lead to their return home to families who, they were told, were eagerly awaiting their return. The psychological manipulation was so sophisticated that many of the children began to believe that they were privileged participants in important medical research rather than victims of systematic abuse, a transformation that Thorne documented with evident satisfaction in his research notes. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities to Thorne's secret operation, as Philadelphia's social season resumed and the city's wealthy families emerged from winter isolation to resume their elaborate social calendars. Wealthy parents began requesting consultations for their own children's behavioral issues, problems that ranged from simple disobedience and academic difficulties to more serious psychological conditions that conventional medicine of the era was powerless to address effectively. Thorne found himself in the paradoxical and increasingly dangerous position of treating the children of the city's elite using techniques and knowledge he had acquired through experiments on kidnapped immigrant children hidden in his basement facility. The irony was not lost on him. The very treatments that had fundamentally altered or destroyed the minds of children like Sarah Montgomery were now being requested by parents willing to pay enormous sums for their application to their own offspring, though in considerably modified and gentler forms. His patient notes from this period, preserved in his private correspondence with colleagues, reveal a man struggling with the ethical implications of his work, while simultaneously being driven by scientific curiosity and professional ambition to continue his research regardless of the human cost. In a letter to Dr. Edmund Hartwell, his primary research partner, Thorne wrote, "I find myself in the peculiar position of healing the children of those who would condemn me if they knew the source of my knowledge. Yet science advances through sacrifice, and if the suffering of a few can alleviate the suffering of many, can we not justify the methods by the outcomes?" Sarah herself had become Thorne's most successful and simultaneously most disturbing case study during the months of her captivity. After extensive pharmaceutical manipulation and psychological conditioning that would be recognized today as systematic torture, she displayed what he termed adaptive dissociation, a psychological condition he had deliberately induced that allowed her to shift between different personality states depending on her circumstances and the demands placed upon her by her captors. When undergoing medical procedures or participating in experimental protocols, Sarah would become clinically detached, observing her own treatment with the dispassionate precision of a trained physician rather than the normal emotional responses of a child experiencing pain and trauma. She would take notes on her own reactions, suggest modifications to experimental procedures that might yield better data, and engage in clinical discussions with Thorne and his colleagues about the psychological and physiological effects of their interventions. When not being actively experimented upon, she would revert to childlike behaviors, though these seemed increasingly artificial and performative, as if she were consciously playing the role of a child rather than actually being one. She would ask for dolls and games, express interest in stories and songs, and display affection toward the adult researchers who were simultaneously her captors and tormentors. This ability to compartmentalize her experiences represented exactly the kind of psychological breakthrough that Thorne had been seeking, though the human cost of achieving it was becoming increasingly apparent even to him. The other children in the facility, by spring 1841, the total had grown to nearly 15, began to display varying degrees of fear toward Sarah, though they struggled to articulate the reasons for their unease. She had learned to anticipate Thorne's experiments with uncanny accuracy, preparing herself mentally and physically for procedures in ways that suggested an understanding of medical science far beyond her years or the scope of her direct experience. More disturbing still, she had begun assisting with procedures performed on other children, displaying a combination of childish curiosity and clinical precision that unnerved even Thorne's most hardened assistants. She would comfort younger children during painful procedures, while simultaneously collecting data on their responses for inclusion in Thorne's research notes, creating a situation in which the victims of the experiments were being used to facilitate further victimization of their fellow captives. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Thorne's primary research partner and the co-founder of their clandestine society, began expressing serious concerns about the direction and implications of their work as spring progressed, and the scope of their experiments expanded beyond their original intentions. His personal correspondence, later discovered among his estate papers following his death in 1847, revealed growing alarm at Sarah's condition and the psychological transformations occurring in other long-term subjects under their care. In a letter to his brother in Boston dated April 3, 1841, Hartwell wrote, "The Montgomery child has developed capacities that suggest our interventions have fundamentally altered her neurological development in ways we did not anticipate and cannot fully control. She demonstrates knowledge acquisition rates that exceed those of our most advanced medical students, yet displays emotional responses that shift with disturbing rapidity between artificial childishness and clinical detachment that rivals our own professional demeanor. I fear we have created something that neither medical science nor human compassion can adequately address, and I question whether our pursuit of knowledge justifies the permanent damage we have inflicted upon developing minds." The spring of 1841 also brought increased attention from Philadelphia's reform-minded citizens, particularly those involved in early advocacy for immigrant rights and child welfare. The Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, though not officially established until decades later, had informal advocates who began investigating reports of missing immigrant children with the methodical determination that would eventually lead to the exposure of Thorne's operation. Rebecca Stanwood, a young Quaker woman whose family had been involved in abolitionist activities and who applied the same moral fervor to child welfare issues, had been documenting disappearances in the Kensington district for several months, creating detailed records that connected multiple cases to similar patterns of official indifference and systematic obstruction of parental attempts to locate their missing children. Stanwood's investigation methods were sophisticated for the era, combining traditional record-keeping with innovative approaches to documentation that included detailed interviews with affected families, systematic mapping of disappearance patterns, and careful analysis of the official responses, or lack thereof, from city authorities. Her work revealed not just individual cases of missing children, but evidence of institutional corruption that enabled and protected systematic child trafficking for medical experimentation. Her investigation led her directly to Mrs. Kellerman, whose German background and linguistic skills made her invaluable in communicating with immigrant families from various European countries who often struggled with English and were intimidated by official authorities. Together they began mapping the disappearances across ethnic and geographic lines, noting the common elements that connected cases despite the apparent randomness of individual incidents. Their collaboration revealed that the missing children shared specific characteristics. They were all from families in severe financial distress. All had demonstrated above-average intelligence or learning capacity. All had been approached by the same network of well-dressed intermediaries, and all had vanished after their parents signed documents that promised medical care or educational opportunities but contained legal language that effectively terminated parental rights under CI. Circumstances that made legal challenges impossible. By summer 1841, the secret facility had expanded significantly to accommodate a growing population of child subjects, with the warehouse basement now housing nearly 20 children ranging in age from 6 to 12 years old. The space had been systematically modified to include multiple primitive surgical suites, an extensive pharmaceutical preparation area, detailed record-keeping facilities, and living quarters that bore increasingly little resemblance to children's bedrooms and more resemblance to institutional housing designed for long-term containment rather than temporary care. Thorne's experiments had evolved beyond simple drug trials and psychological conditioning to include what he termed behavioral modification through controlled trauma, a systematic approach that involved exposing children to carefully calibrated physical and psychological stresses designed to break down their natural resistance to authority while simultaneously enhancing their capacity to absorb and retain complex information under extreme duress. The daily routine in the facility had become a carefully orchestrated blend of education, experimentation, and psychological manipulation that created an environment in which children learned to view their suffering as both inevitable and beneficial. Morning sessions involved traditional academic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic, but with curriculum specifically designed to incorporate medical terminology and concepts that would be useful in their roles as experimental subjects. Afternoon sessions involved direct participation in medical procedures, with children serving as both subjects and assistants, depending on the requirements of specific experiments. They learned to administer injections, monitor vital signs during procedures, maintain detailed records of symptoms and reactions, and provide emotional support to other children undergoing traumatic treatments, all while being subjected to ongoing pharmaceutical manipulation that altered their psychological development in ways that made normal emotional responses increasingly difficult. Sarah Montgomery had become not just Thorne's most successful experimental subject, but an unwilling collaborator in the systematic abuse of other children, a transformation that represented both the pinnacle of his research achievements and the most damning evidence of the moral bankruptcy of his methods. Her months of conditioning had created a child who could administer complex medical procedures with the precision of a trained physician, while maintaining enough childlike characteristics to comfort and manipulate other young victims. Her role in the facility had evolved to include responsibilities that would have been unthinkable in any legitimate medical or educational institution. She conducted initial psychological assessments of new arrivals, assisted in the preparation of pharmaceutical compounds used in experiments, and served as a liaison between the adult researchers and the other children, translating complex medical concepts into language that younger subjects could understand, while simultaneously preparing them psychologically for the procedures they would undergo. More disturbing still, she had begun to demonstrate what Thorne described as empathic detachment, a psychological condition he had deliberately cultivated that allowed her to provide genuine emotional comfort to other children during traumatic procedures while simultaneously collecting detailed data on their responses for inclusion in his research documentation. This ability to function simultaneously as victim, perpetrator, and observer represented exactly the kind of psychological breakthrough that Thorne had been seeking through his research, though the human cost of achieving it was becoming impossible to ignore. The breaking point came in late July when a new subject, a 6-year-old Polish boy named Stanisław Kowalczyk, died during one of Thorne's experiments with mercury poisoning, a death that was not accidental, but rather the inevitable result of Thorne's increasingly reckless pursuit of what he called threshold research. He had been testing the lethal thresholds of various compounds, using graduated doses administered over extended periods to establish what he termed therapeutic windows for future treatments, research that inherently required some subjects to be pushed beyond the limits of human survival. The child's death was meticulously documented in Thorne's research notes, which described the progression of symptoms with clinical detachment while noting opportunities for methodological improvements in future experiments. Sarah Montgomery witnessed this death and, according to Thorne's detailed observations, displayed a reaction that alarmed even him despite his extensive experience with psychological manipulation and trauma conditioning. Rather than displaying the trauma, grief or horror that would be expected from a normal 8-year-old child witnessing the death of a younger companion, Sarah demonstrated what Thorne described as clinical curiosity enhanced by emotional engagement. She examined the boy's body immediately after death, took detailed notes on the progression of symptoms she had observed, asked sophisticated questions about the physiological processes that had led to his death, and suggested modifications to experimental protocols that might prevent similar outcomes in future research. Her response was so thoroughly medicalized and intellectually sophisticated that Thorne began to question whether his experiments had succeeded beyond his intentions, creating a psychological transformation so complete that the original child had effectively ceased to exist. In his private notes he wrote, "Subject S41 has achieved a level of dissociative adaptation that exceeds our theoretical projections. The death of subject P17, Stanisław, produced responses that suggest complete integration of clinical methodology with emotional processing. I question whether we have created a medical professional in the body of a child or something entirely unprecedented in human psychology." Dr. Hartwell's concerns crystallized into decisive action following the Polish boy's death, which represented a moral line that he found himself unable to cross despite years of participation in increasingly questionable research practices. He began secretly documenting the facility's operations, not for scientific purposes, but as evidence of what he now recognized as systematic criminal activity that had evolved far beyond the bounds of legitimate medical research. His clandestine documentation included detailed sketches of the children's living conditions, copies of Thorne's experimental protocols, photographs taken with primitive daguerreotype equipment, and most importantly, comprehensive medical records that documented the physical and psychological damage inflicted upon each child over months or years of systematic abuse. His records also included detailed plans of the facility's layout, security procedures, and daily operational routines, information that would prove crucial in planning the children's eventual rescue. Most importantly, Hartwell began developing a comprehensive plan for the children's escape, a process that required careful timing, outside assistance, and the cooperation of reform advocates who had been investigating missing immigrant children from outside the medical establishment. He had learned through his connections in city government that health officials were planning a comprehensive inspection of warehouse districts following reports of cholera outbreaks near the port, an inspection that could provide the perfect opportunity to expose Thorne's operation if properly coordinated with outside advocates. He arranged for Rebecca Stanwood and Mrs. Kellerman to be present during the official inspection, armed with detailed lists of missing children's names and physical descriptions, medical evidence of systematic abuse, and legal documentation that would make official suppression of the scandal impossible even for Philadelphia's notoriously corrupt political establishment. The plan required precise coordination because Thorne had become increasingly paranoid about discovery as the scope of his operation expanded and the number of missing children attracted more attention from reform advocates. He had established elaborate security procedures, maintained detailed records on city officials who might pose threats to his operation, and developed contingency plans for destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses if exposure became imminent. On the morning of August 3, 1841, as city inspectors approached the warehouse district as part of their official investigation into public health concerns, Thorne made a desperate decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall, but nearly result in the deaths of all the children under his control. Rather than face exposure, prosecution, and the destruction of his medical career, he decided to eliminate all evidence of his activities, including the children who represented the most damning proof of his crimes. He prepared massive doses of laudanum mixed with mercury compounds, intending to administer lethal injections to all subjects while documenting their deaths as casualties of a cholera outbreak that had supposedly spread through the facility before official inspectors arrived. His plan was to claim that he had been operating a charitable medical facility for immigrant children when disease struck, killing all patients despite his heroic efforts to save them. a story that would transform him from criminal to tragic hero while eliminating all witnesses to his experimental activities. But Sarah Montgomery, whose months of intensive conditioning had given her an intimate understanding of Thorne's methods, psychological state, and pharmaceutical preparations, recognized the lethal intent behind his activities immediately. Her chemically altered brain, trained to analyze medical procedures with clinical precision, identified the preparation's deadly nature and realized that Thorne intended to murder all the children to protect himself from exposure. What happened next would be remembered by the surviving children for the rest of their lives, though their testimonies would be dismissed by authorities as trauma-induced fantasies until corroborating evidence emerged decades later. Sarah Montgomery, the 8-year-old girl who had been systematically transformed into something between victim and collaborator, made the choice that would save the other children's lives while ensuring her own permanent psychological destruction. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Philadelphia intensifies beyond anything we could have imagined. If this story is giving you chills and you want to know how Sarah Montgomery's terrifying ordeal concludes, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened in that warehouse basement will shock you, and we're about to discover together how a child's mind, twisted by months of medical experimentation, became the key to saving lives while destroying her own future. Let's discover together what happens next in Sarah Montgomery's devastating tale. Sarah Montgomery's final confrontation with Dr. Cornelius Thorne in the basement laboratory of the warehouse facility revealed the full, horrifying extent of what his months of systematic experimentation had created. Not just a traumatized child, but something unprecedented in medical literature. An 8-year-old mind that had been chemically and psychologically restructured to function with the clinical precision of a trained physician while retaining the emotional needs and vulnerabilities of a young child. As Thorne prepared the lethal injections intended to silence his victims permanently, Sarah approached him with the calm, measured demeanor that had become her default response to medical situations. She began speaking in the precise clinical terminology he had drilled into her consciousness through months of pharmaceutical conditioning and psychological manipulation, but her words carried an analytical depth that caught him completely off guard. She described in precise medical language that demonstrated complete understanding of pharmaceutical interactions and human physiology, the exact effects that concentrated laudanum mixed with mercury compounds would have on child physiology. She explained the timeline of symptoms that would occur: the initial drowsiness and confusion, followed by respiratory depression, cardiac arrhythmia, and eventual death by asphyxiation. But more importantly, she detailed the specific ways in which the deaths would be discovered and analyzed by investigators, despite his efforts at concealment. Her words stopped Thorne cold because they revealed not just medical knowledge, but strategic thinking that exceeded his own planning capabilities. Here was an 8-year-old child, speaking with the authority and analytical precision of a trained physician, calmly explaining why his plan would fail from both medical and investigative perspectives. She pointed out details he had overlooked in his desperation: the distinctive odor of concentrated opium that would linger in the warehouse for days, the pattern of chemical burns on the children's throats that would indicate forced ingestion, and the fact that Mrs. Kellerman had already provided investigators with detailed physical descriptions of the missing children that would make identification inevitable even if their faces were damaged by the poisoning process. But Sarah's intervention wasn't motivated by heroism or moral awakening in any conventional sense. Her months of conditioning had created something far more disturbing than a child who had learned to resist her captors. They had created a child whose primary motivation had become clinical curiosity about human suffering and psychological breakdown. She wanted to observe what would happen when the authorities arrived. She wanted to document Thorne's psychological disintegration under pressure. She wanted to record the responses of the other children when they realized they might be rescued, and she wanted to analyze the entire situation as a fascinating case study in human behavior under extreme stress. The confrontation between Thorn and his most successful subject lasted nearly an hour, with Sarah methodically dismantling every aspect of his escape plan, using knowledge he had taught her through months of brutal experimentation. She explained the legal implications of mass child murder, described the investigative techniques that would be used to trace the children's deaths back to him, and predicted with chilling accuracy the psychological profile that authorities would develop based on the evidence they would find in the facility. Most disturbing of all, she offered alternative suggestions for his consideration, ways he could modify his plan to increase his chances of avoiding detection, methods for disposing of evidence more effectively, and pharmaceutical combinations that would leave fewer traces in the children's bodies. Her suggestions were delivered with the same clinical detachment she had learned to apply to her own suffering, as if she were discussing an interesting theoretical problem rather than the planned murder of herself and her fellow captives. The other children watched in terrified silence as their 8-year-old companion demonstrated a grasp of human psychology, medical science, and criminal methodology that exceeded that of their adult captor. Some of the younger children began crying, not from fear of death, but from the horror of realizing that Sarah had become something that was no longer entirely human in any recognizable sense. When the warehouse doors finally burst open and city inspectors flooded into the basement facility, they found a scene that defied comprehension and challenged every assumption about childhood, innocence, and the limits of human psychological adaptation. Dr. Cornelius Thorn sat motionless in a chair, staring at a small girl who was calmly explaining to the other children what would happen next, how they would be questioned, what they should say to minimize additional trauma to themselves, and why some of their memories might seem unclear due to the pharmaceutical treatments they had received over the preceding months. Rebecca Stanwood's detailed testimony, preserved in the Philadelphia Historical Society archives, described finding children who seemed to exist in different stages of psychological development simultaneously. Some displayed the innocence and trauma responses expected of abused children, crying, seeking comfort, asking for their parents, and showing obvious signs of physical and emotional damage. Others, particularly those who had been in the facility longest, demonstrated knowledge and behavioral patterns that seemed impossible for their ages, speaking in medical terminology and displaying emotional responses that seemed artificially constructed rather than genuinely felt. Sarah Montgomery stood apart from all of them, existing in a category that the investigators had no framework for understanding. When questioned by city officials, she provided detailed accounts of the experimental procedures with the precision of a trained medical observer, described the facility's layout and operational procedures with architectural and administrative accuracy, and explained Thorn's research methodologies using technical language that the investigators had to have confirmed by consulting with other physicians. Yet between these clinical recitations, she would suddenly revert to asking for her mother, expressing concern about a lost doll or crying over minor disappointments, displaying the emotional needs and responses of the 8-year-old she still was, beneath the layers of psychological conditioning and pharmaceutical manipulation that had transformed her into something unprecedented in medical literature. Dr. Thorn never stood trial for his crimes. Within 6 hours of the facility's discovery, he was found dead in his Walnut Street office, apparently from a self-administered overdose of the same mercury compounds he had used in his experiments. His suicide note, written in the same clinical language he had used throughout his research documentation, described Sarah Montgomery as the most successful and most tragic outcome of our investigations into the malleability of human consciousness, and concluded with the observation that science demands sacrifices, but perhaps some knowledge is too terrible to possess. The official investigation into what became known in Philadelphia newspapers as the Kensington Children incident lasted 6 weeks and concluded with findings that satisfied no one involved, not the families of the victims, not the reform advocates who had worked to expose the crimes, and certainly not the medical establishment that found itself under unprecedented scrutiny for the first time in the city's history. The Philadelphia Medical Society disavowed any connection to Thorne's work, claiming he had operated independently despite overwhelming evidence of institutional support, funding, and collaboration from respected members of the medical community. City officials declared that 11 children had been recovered from unlawful detention and would be returned to their families, though witnesses reported seeing nearly twice that number in the facility, and several children who had been documented as missing were never accounted for in the official records. Most of the rescued children were eventually reunited with their families, though the process took months and required extensive medical treatment that the city was reluctant to fund and the medical establishment was hesitant to provide. The long-term effects of their experiences varied dramatically depending on the duration and intensity of their captivity. Some recovered sufficiently to live relatively normal lives, their memories of the warehouse facility fading over time, or being suppressed through what we now recognize as psychological defense mechanisms. Others struggled with behavioral issues, learning difficulties, and psychological problems that 1840s medicine had no framework for understanding or treating effectively. Sarah Montgomery's case proved the most challenging for authorities, medical professionals, and her own family. Her parents, Bridget and Seamus, had immigrated to Philadelphia believing they could provide their daughter with opportunities unavailable in Ireland's increasingly desperate economic situation. They found instead that they had delivered her into circumstances that had destroyed the child they had known while creating something unprecedented in medical literature, a being who possessed the knowledge and analytical capabilities of a trained physician contained within the body and emotional framework of a traumatized 8-year-old girl. The reunification process revealed the full scope of Sarah's transformation and the permanent nature of the psychological changes that had been inflicted upon her. She retained perfect recall of her months in captivity, could describe in exhaustive detail every procedure performed on herself and other children, and demonstrated medical knowledge that surpassed many practicing physicians of the era. Yet she also displayed profound confusion about basic social relationships, struggled with age-appropriate emotional responses, and seemed unable to distinguish between clinical observation and human empathy in her interactions with family members and other children. Mrs. Kellerman, whose methodical documentation had proved crucial to the investigation and whose personal experiences with authoritarian medical practices in Prussia gave her unique insights into the psychological effects of systematic abuse, took particular interest in Sarah's recovery process. She established a small fund to support the Montgomery family and other victims of what she termed medical tyranny disguised as scientific progress, and she worked with Rebecca Stanwood to document the long-term effects of the children's experiences for future researchers and advocates. The broader implications of the warehouse facility's discovery sent shockwaves through Philadelphia's medical establishment and influenced medical education and research practices throughout the United States. Reform advocates used the incident to push for greater oversight of medical research, standardized ethical guidelines for human experimentation, and legal protections for vulnerable populations who might be targeted for research purposes. However, traditionalists in the medical community argued that Thorne's crimes should not be used to impede legitimate scientific investigation, and the debate continued for years without resulting in significant changes to medical practice or legal frameworks. Sarah Montgomery lived to adulthood, though the child who had been taken from her parents in January 1841 never truly returned to them. The young woman who bore her name possessed capabilities and knowledge that made her invaluable to medical researchers while simultaneously making normal social relationships and emotional development nearly impossible. She never married, never had children of her own, and spent most of her adult life as an unofficial consultant to physicians treating unusual psychological cases, work that allowed her to use her unique knowledge while avoiding the emotional demands of conventional social relationships. Her final years were spent writing detailed memoirs of her experiences, documents that were deemed too disturbing for publication during her lifetime, but which provided the most complete account of early medical experimentation on children ever recorded. These writings, discovered in the 1920s among the papers of a Philadelphia physician who had consulted with her on difficult cases, provided medical historians with unprecedented insights into the psychological effects of systematic trauma and pharmaceutical manipulation on developing minds. The warehouse where the experiments took place was demolished in 1847, officially due to structural concerns, though many believe the destruction was intended to eliminate physical evidence of the atrocities that had been committed there. The site now lies beneath a parking lot in Philadelphia's Northern Liberties neighborhood, unmarked except for a small plaque installed by the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1991, exactly 150 years after Sarah Montgomery's rescue. This mystery shows us how the pursuit of scientific knowledge without ethical constraints can create horrors that exceed the worst intentions of individual criminals. The boundary between healing and harm, between research and exploitation, remains as relevant today as it was in 1841 Philadelphia. Sarah Montgomery's story reminds us that some knowledge comes at costs too terrible to justify, and that the most vulnerable members of society often pay the highest price for what we call medical progress. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about what happened to Sarah Montgomery and the other children in that warehouse? Leave your comment below, and let me know if you think there are still secrets buried in Philadelphia's medical archives. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of history holds countless secrets, and we've only just begun to uncover them. See you in the next video.